segundo painel, que vai abordar o tema Transição na China, política e sociedade. Já estão conosco, compondo o palco, o senhor Kerry Brown, diretor executivo do Centro de Estudos da China da Universidade de Sidney, também o senhor David Kelly, diretor de pesquisas do China Policy e professor da Universidade de Pequim. Para moderar este painel já está conosco também o senhor Felipe Corazza, jornalista do jornal O Estado de São Paulo, a quem imediatamente passamos a palavra. Senhor Felipe, por favor.
Bom dia a todos, obrigado mais uma vez pela presença. Agradecemos também especialmente ao senhor David Kelly, ao senhor Kerry Brown. Vamos tentar nesse painel dar um panorama do que vem por aí após essa transição chinesa, uma nova geração que assume o poder, mas ainda tem que lidar com uma velha geração que não deixou completamente o comitê central do partido. E vamos tentar ver também qual é o impacto que essa transição deve ter para quem observa e tenta entrar ou trabalhar no ambiente de negócios da China. Sem mais delongas, passo a palavra então ao Sr. David Kelly.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. My first visit as well to South America. What I will be presenting will be is already out of the order of the published agenda today, because it flows on logically from Professor Law's presentation, and in many ways it will set the scene for Professor Brown. Both of these scholars' work is familiar to me, and it's a great pleasure also to work with them. And you will see that there is some family resemblance, if you like, in the framework. What I have to get through in 15-20 minutes is a largely abstract view of Chinese society, but converging towards the end on issues which are of policy significance. I think that there is no alternative to us. We must engage to understand the complexity of Chinese society. In many parts of the world, I have found that people know that China is important, it is relevant to their interests, but it is very difficult to deal with the language difference, the great volume of the history that has to be understood, and the complexities of the economy and of the culture and of the history. What we really have no alternative. So what you're going to hear now is the core of a course which I shall be giving in Peking University next year, a semester course at MA level. And please, if there are any teachers here in the audience, send me your students. I would love to have a sizable group of students from Brazil. The course will be taught in English, and this is because Peking University has a new statute requiring the departments, including the department to which I'm a visiting professor, which is the sociology department. These departments are required to provide 3 courses in English per semester. This is new, and it shows you what is happening in China as China steps up to its position in the global educational arena. So now let me begin. You'll see a black swan. You probably know there's a book called The Black Swan. The author is using the black swan as a symbol of uncertainty, the unknown, the sudden emerging fact which contradicts one's assumptions. And I will be using my time to give you an impression of why China is a source of uncertainty. I want to be very clear that uncertainty is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't use the word uncertainty in the sense of risk or threat or danger. Of course, it may become so. Also, China is not unique as a source of uncertainty. in China, I often track commentary on the internet about the uncertainty that people feel. And usually when they talk about uncertainty, it's connected with the word America. The United States of America is seen in China as the source of their greatest uncertainty. And you can understand why. Particularly this, if you like, if I drew a curve of this connection, it would be very great after the subprime mortgage crisis and the financial crisis. But I will be arguing and trying to show that China has certain unique features which make it an amplifier of uncertainty occurring elsewhere and within, and it amplifies these uncertainties and, in a way, inevitably, in dealing with them, exports some kind of uncertainty. Now, to move through this presentation, do I press a button? The green button? The big green button. Okay, sorry. Okay, so you'll see that everything is divided into three. I have big sections A, B, and C, and each one of them is subdivided into three. And I must go through this as quickly as possible, and if there's anything is unclear, perhaps we can deal with it in questions. So we talk about structural roots of uncertainty, which are amplified as they find expression, and they are exported to the world. So those things I will deal with in A are topics of political culture and of intellectual history and of the assumptions which lie behind the day-to-day policies in the governance and law field, and also in the economic field and in cultural matters as well. The second part, B, is going to be about the regulatory sphere that is the result of dealing with everyday problems against this backdrop. And the final part of exported to the world, I think, will be self-explanatory. So, in my outline, national identity is a crucial factor. And some of this, I think, is discussed in Luo Xiaopeng's presentation, which you just heard. Every nation state has to deal with its identity. The people who live there ask the question, who are we? And the answer is in some way given by the state, by its education system, or by local culture. And in China, there are unusual circumstances. China has a very ancient history, and to manifest the values that have come down from the past in a new world, in a world in which China is no longer alone as a civilization, has been a problem for 200 years. And this problem is not fully resolved. In many ways, there has been a successful transition, and all of those phenomena that Luo Xiaopeng mentioned, I would accept as landmarks on the way. The transition from the empire, the revolution and reform era. Legitimacy. I'll discuss that very briefly. I live in China. I work and I have lived there for 12 years. I obviously do not think China is a failed state. I find it a place that I'm able to live in safety, security. I have never been seriously sick, but I will still be talking about food safety as an issue. But this, I have to underline that China is, many ways, a successful state. And the government of China, the party state in China, is in many ways a legitimate party. Nonetheless, there are always question marks about such statements. These are all, just as in the economy has growth rates and inflation rates, so there are rises and falls of what we call legitimacy of national identity and even of national unity. I need to go back, actually. Now let me carry on. Legitimacy is in my formulation, something like a credit rating. A government can have made mistakes, it can be in a terrible problem, it can go through things like the disasters of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and yet remain legitimate. Just as a bank a credit rating, you may be literally out of funds, but the bank will still allow you to draw on your credit rating. And on the other side, you may be in funds and yet have not be able to use your credit card. So these things have a complex relationship. And the sources of legitimacy of the Chinese state, which is a very important aspect of explaining the political system, are very deep and very many. The party state in China has resources of legitimacy which are quite unlike that of, say, Russia in the Soviet Union, in the old Soviet Union. And the transition of states from the socialist bloc to what is now the states of Eastern Europe were conditioned by the fact that the governments in those countries were seen as lacking legitimacy, and people formed a consensus, and there was a transition from that. China is not in that situation. The present party state in China can point to its successful expulsion of the Japanese invaders and of other rivals, and it is homegrown. It does not bear the problems of being imposed from a foreign power. Nonetheless, the questions are asked: why this form of government? Why you? Why do we obey you? And this question comes and goes from time to time. And I assure you that inside China, this question is discussed openly. In this last year, there have been discussions in the Chinese policy sphere which raise this kind of question. I don't want to go into that particularly here. That might be left to Kerry Brown. But these are part of the background to why China is, in some sense, an amplifier of uncertainty. Now I want to briefly talk about national unity, which was on my previous screen. National unity is one of the principal value structures of the Chinese political system. The Chinese government repeatedly says that without the Communist Party there would be no new China, and that includes the sense of the present-day map of China, which is in itself 300 or 400 years old. The current shape of China, the territorial extent of China, was formulated in the Ming period and is almost the same today. And that is a very important part of the government's role, is to keep that shape and to maintain the unity of China. The unity of China is in some ways analogous to a religion in other societies. China does not have a national religion. It cannot use a simple label like Islam or Christianity or Buddhism. It I would argue, has something of the value construct of national unity, functions in the same way as a national faith. It is impossible, for example, to rise to the top of Chinese politics unless you are absolutely a fervent and sincere believer in national unity. I wanted to go back, but oh, that's back. Okay, thank you. Well, you can see there that was my last, and I call it the Holy Grail because if you know the legend of King Arthur, it's something which is still in question. We're still searching for this thing because China is in fact severely lacking in the final elements of unity. There are parts of China that are claimed by China that are not yet within their borders. These are three dynamic variables which mean that the Chinese political life has not yet settled down. It is still formulating answers to these questions. Who are we? Why is this particular political system here? And what is our position in the world? let me go forward now to what I said was the expression in daily life. And there we see these three things come together to make it very hard to have a perfect regulatory system. You will find that because of the demand for central unity, it is very hard for the regions to have a full range of regulatory powers. This is one of the reasons that scandals like the food safety scandal have emerged. And here I closely follow Luo Xiaopeng's notions of hierarchical rent sharing and of the lack of mechanisms for region-to-region balancing. And another aspect of this is that to get a regulatory system that works, for example, in the civil aviation field, it's a very safe field, but it is high cost. For the Chinese political system to achieve a regulatory satisfactory basis for civil aviation has come at a high cost, and it is not possible yet to do it for every other field of government policy. Now, I want to come now to the question of social justice, which is going to, if I have time, be a major theme. A socialist market was based on the fact that, on a theory of social justice coming from Marxism, which privileged the workers. The worker is supposed to have primary social justice given to them. In the reform era, this has been very hard to maintain, and therefore the government itself placed social justice on the policy stage 5 years ago at the 17th National Party Congress. For the first time, this expression, social justice, was announced as a policy objective. It was connected with certain other themes, social harmony, the scientific development outlook, but the core of this was the conscious policy mechanisms to even out the access to wealth, to opportunity. The expression equality of opportunity was used for, I think, the first time. In earlier times, it was assumed that once you had a revolution, once there was a communist party running the country, social justice is taken care of. And this has proven to be not the case, and that is why this has been a major change of the policy environment. But it turns out that, as in the words in line, the line labeled 6 there, citizen rights versus stateless entitlement, social justice cannot be achieved from the top down. And this has been understood. There has to be, of course, a top-down policy environment which sets rules, which enacts laws, but there has to be a citizen push from below which demands rights. In the system of hierarchical rent sharing that we heard about earlier, this system is not based on legal rights. It is based on status entitlements. And in this sense, China has retained certain core aspects of the empire that existed before. In some ways, it is like a medieval society. You belong to the land does not belong to you. You have rights to follow your leader, but you cannot challenge the leader. The leader is expected to provide for your well-being, but you are in a position of subjecthood. You are a subject and not a citizen. So the great challenge for China today, in broad social terms, is the transition from subjecthood to citizenship. This is not my idea. This is not a critical position. This is the consensus of a very large sector of China's academic establishment. The citations needed for that would go on forever and ever. Let me go quickly now and say that these are the factors which make it impossible for China to be absolutely transparent to the world. It has not yet solved the questions. It has not yet found the answers. And in this situation, China is bound to, as it solves its own problems, it is going to, in removing the uncertainty, some of this is going to flow to the outside. And on that point, I think I should leave it and leave any further explanation to question time. Thank you.
Muito obrigado ao professor David Kelly. Passamos então a palavra ao professor Kerry Brown.
Great, well thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's my first visit, like everyone else, David and Xiaoping, to Brazil and to Latin America. And I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me. As well as being based at Sydney University, I, through the Europe-China Research and Advice Network, advise the European Union on their policy towards China. But today, what I will say will not be a reflection of European policy. Thank God. There is a famous story about 15 years ago when British Prime Minister John Major met Boris Yeltsin, then the newly arrived president of Russia. And he asked Boris Yeltsin, President Yeltsin, how is the Russian economy? And Mr. Yeltsin said, good. And then Mr. Major, the British Prime Minister, said, but could you say a bit more, maybe explain a bit more, maybe say a few more words about what's happening? And Mr. Yeltsin thought and then went, not good. What I'm going to say will probably divide into good and not good. I think that covers almost all human knowledge. I guess when we look at the leadership transition in Beijing last week, we don't really see anything about policy. But of course, a leadership transition will lead to issues of policy. And so what I'm going to talk about really are the very practical issues that I suppose you here are going to have to think about what kind of policies we could expect from the Chinese government to deal with both the structural issues and also the very specific deliverables that policy can bring. I suppose that the final issue that we're going to talk about is, well, what does reform mean? Everyone in the Chinese system talks of the need for reform. They have talked of that since 1978. But we have to think about, well, what kinds of reform? What choices and what kind of crossroads moments do we come to when we think about the specifics of reform and the costs of reform, the political risks of reform? The next decade will be dominated by, I think, two big challenges. The first is efficiency. Nicholas Lardy talked about the kinds of structural challenges within the Chinese economy at the moment and for the next 5 years. But really we have to think about growth through efficiency. China has an amazing factory of GDP growth that has been a big success in the Hu Jintao period. But we have to think of GDP growth also being linked with efficiency in the future. The second issue, the second great challenge, is governance. And that is not just about economic governance and social governance and political governance and the governance of the whole of society. Governance is a key means to deliver efficiency. The great overarching objective, we know that. That has been stated in many government documents, to become a middle-income status country by 2020. But that is a treacherous path. That is a difficult path to take. That's a very tough path to take. And societies that have been through that path have to go through many, many structural readjustments and difficulties. And therefore, this journey to middle-income status is one that is beset by many, many issues. There are three issues at the heart of this. The one is political will. Do the political elite really want to deliver these changes that could make this middle-income status possible for such a complex and diverse economy and country as China? The second is clarity of policy, communication of policy. And the third is political consensus. These are tough things to deliver. When we look at the challenges, I'll divide them into structural and then the very specifics. The structural challenges will deliver security and stability. These are absolutely important. Why have policies? Why not have no policies at all? Well, I suppose you need these policies to guide a society and its vision, especially as it is undertaking the kind of very complex reforms and transition that China is currently doing. I guess there's a sort of list of particular structural issues that we have to look at. Urbanization is the first. We know from the national audit, the national census in 2010, that China is now 50-50 between urban and rural residents. But there is this structural issue, of course, of the household registration documents, the hukou, and the fact of what kind of access to social welfare they give. And though this has been discussed Many times at the National People's Congress, the reform of the hukou system, the residence permit system, it has still not really been resolved. And there are different rights and different accesses to social goods, depending on which kind of document people hold. Urbanization is creating a new kind of society. It's recreating the sorts of family structures, the kinds of lives that modern Chinese live. It is also linked, of course, to a society which is aging very quickly because of the one-child policies of the last 4 decades, and also society which is undertaking great demographic changes. And therefore, urbanization really lies at the heart of the kinds of changes that China will be undergoing, physically, as well as politically and socially in the next decade, as it becomes a much more urban society. The second is social security. Well, this is, of course, a massive issue. The cost of social security in terms not only of its funding, but also of the people that have access to it, the ways in which it's delivered. There is great variation in terms of healthcare, in terms of access to particular public goods across China. And those are probably in need of urgent reform, but of course there is a very great challenge about how they are funded. There are differences between the sorts of public goods available in cities and in the countryside. And there is also the issue, of course, of citizen stakeholders in this process and what they want from it. The things that Hu Jintao talked about in 2007 at the Congress then, public participation in decision-making about the architecture of this social security. There are structural issues about creating a service sector economy. I was in Shanghai last week. One of the complaints of the Bureau for Policy Planning in Shanghai said that was for each unit of GDP growth now, the costs in terms of the environment, in terms of society, are too high, that China is taking, is really having to pay too high a cost for each unit of GDP growth it gives. And that therefore it needs to create what is spelt out in the current 12th five-year program till 2015, a higher value economy, a service sector economy. But of course this is very, very tough, and it has enormous implications for the educational sector. Fiscal rebalancing, the fourth. Well, we have a very centralized system in which maybe 50,000 bureaucrats in Beijing are making decisions about the whole of the country. It's in fact an incredibly small bureaucratic elite. And yet there is a need to give provinces, the 31 provinces and autonomous regions, more decision-making powers. But that is politically very risky. And therefore you have this constant tension between the powers of Beijing and the powers of provinces, and the ways in which efficiency can be given over decision-making publicly, provincially, which do not carry political risks and kinds of decentralization for Beijing. The fourth is, well, the function of rule of law. Wen Jiabao has talked about this very specifically, and today, in the ASEAN meeting, which I think is being held in Thailand, he talks about the need to continue delivering reform of the rule of law, and the fact that he felt that his great contribution in the last 10 years had really been for this. Rule of law leads to predictability, to the creation of a society in which there is more security through predictability. But of course it carries risks for vested interest, and these are probably going to be most resistant to laws which may well feel to be impinging on their areas of social and commercial activity. Rule of law is at the heart of the need to deliver social management. Social management has been talked about densely, and indeed Xi Jinping, during his brief comments after coming out at the 18th Party Congress as the new party secretary on the 15th of November, talked of social management. So did Hu Jintao on the 8th of November when he made his work report. Social management is critical because Chinese society, since the entry to the World Trade Organization in 2001, has become highly contentious. There are many conflicts between different areas of interest, many conflicts between different groups, and the costs of policing this contention, we can put a figure on it. In fact, at the National People's Congress, internal security costs $111 billion a year, 5 billion more than national defense. This is a very costly and inefficient way to try and deal with that issue of social cohesion. How do you efficiently manage these tensions in society at a time in which people are becoming richer, their expectations towards government are becoming greater, the divisions between generations and their views of what they want from society, which we can see in social media, are becoming far more varied, far more diverse. So social management, delivering that through rule of law is important. And finally, the issue, the vision of social cohesion. For a society undergoing incredible change, for a society which is undergoing great structural and social change, what is the common vision across all of these diverse regional, ethnic, and social groups? Where is the common ground in their views of society between entrepreneurs, who of course have become immensely wealthy in the last 3 decades, farmers, who are the sources of most of the petitions to the central government over grievances, particularly over land and property rights, and the middle class, probably the group that we know least about, but the group that are most important at the moment for the future stability of China. How, with all of this diversity, do you create a stakeholder society? And in particular, how do you define the role of non-government, of the non-state actors, when there is at the moment no secure legal base for them, despite the fact that it has been discussed a great deal by the Parliament, the National People's Congress, in which there is no proper charity law, in which there is no real proper role for groups, in fact, which have a very clear role, in fact, in delivering social cohesion and social management. When we look at the specifics, finally, I think we can go through a list of what the kind of policy challenges for this new leadership are going to be. And we know them because they have been discussed many, many times over the last decade. They have been written about by people at the party school, by academics, and spoken about by political leaders. But there is still no real political will on how each of these issues is approached, when and what kinds of unknown risks may come from implementing them. The first is tax. In the last decade, state-owned enterprises, as a result of the Jiang Zemin-Zhurongji era reforms, have very surprisingly become incredible sources of profit. They are the central state's cash machine. They contribute 50% of fiscal revenue to the central state. And yet they are not efficient. We know this. And therefore, this tax burden from state-owned enterprises is almost certainly going to have to fall, and the tax burden from private individuals is going to have to rise. That is currently less than 10% of central tax revenues. That's a very strange statistic, because in most countries, I presume also in Brazil, personal taxation is high. I mean, it's probably 40 to 50% of the overall revenues. And that transition from personal taxation, from taxation from state-owned enterprises being the central source of funds for the state, to that from personal individuals, well, this is one that carries big political risks. Because, of course, the more you pay in tax, the more you do become a stakeholder, and the greater your expectations towards the state. And that is a very different final contractual relationship between the state and the individual than the one that exists at the moment in China. The second is pensions. We know it's an aging society. We know, for instance, that pensions are the highest costs that the state provincially and nationally has to pay. Sichuan province, for instance, in the southwest of China, 90% of its revenues have to go on funding of pensions. And yet, pensions are only available to those with urban hukou, urban household registration documents. There's a very different kind of system in the countryside. Pensions are going to, like anywhere else, become extremely difficult to fund. But there is this need, of course, in a society in which at the moment, at least for women, the retirement age is 55, for men 60, there's going to be a big need to fund this pension burden. The third, of course, is the issues of the environment. We talked about this a great deal. This is a common problem. The problems of moving from a densely manufacturing economy to one in which there is a stronger role for the service sector. But this is still going to have to address the issues of, the issues of, what do you do about the devastating impact of the environment and China's industrial model on the environment over the last 30 years, and the cleanup that's going to have to happen. A particular area here, of course, is the role of water, and the fact that so much of Chinese supply of water at the moment is polluted, something like 70 to 80%. The fourth is food security. China is a country with a surprising lack of agricultural land. A lot of agricultural land in the last decade has been used to build and urbanize. And therefore, food security has suddenly become a big, big issue. China is a net importer of many of its staple foods now. And the government in the next decade has made one of its stated aims to do something about that and to make sure that it is independent of food needs and it's dependent only on its internal suppliers. And the final issue is the creation of what we call an innovative society, an innovative industry, an innovative economy. There's a 15-year plan from 2006 going to 2020 that talks about the creation of innovation. Well, this is not just product innovation, it's also management innovation, and to realize that vision, my guess is that the non-state sector will be absolutely critical. And therefore that brings me really to the conclusions. Well, having heard this big list of policy challenges, what is our role? What's your role in Brazil? What's our role in Australia or Europe or America? Where do we come into this? First of all, we have to demonstrate policy relevancy. We cannot be outsiders, as David Kelly said. This isn't something we can walk away from. We are involved because of the deep globalized nature of the Chinese economy in terms of supply chains, flows of capital, outward and inward investment. China is a truly global actor. We are part of this, right? And the reason why we are part of this is because we always were part of it, right, since the day it started in 1978. There are two things I think we can look at. The first is we have to create, with the Chinese government, a common policy language. We have to get over the trust deficit. We have to get over some of these big historic and current burdens in which the Chinese elite don't regard us as being allies in the reform program challenges that I just talked about. Creating a common policy language won't be easy, but our political elites have to do that. And certainly I imagine for people in Brazil, it's easier maybe than from Europe or America. The second is we have to look at the critical role of the growth of the non-state sector in China. These are going to be absolutely critical for the growth of the Chinese economy, for the delivery of jobs, for the delivery of innovation. The non-state sector are absolutely allies. They are politically non-contentious. They're the kinds of people that we should be encouraging to invest abroad and helping to internationalize. And I know that Huawei will be speaking later on. Of course, they're absolutely representative of the rise of the non-state sector in China. Finally, I suppose there is the issue far beyond not just these policy changes, but also, well, what does China want? Wang Yang, when he was party secretary of Guangdong, talked of the policies to create a happy China. There was a book by Wang Xiaodong and others in 2009 talking of China not being happy, unhappy China, in which the outside world was regarded as somehow antagonistic or opposed to China's increased prominence. Well, I work for a think tank, or I did used to work for a think tank, and therefore we are part of the entertainment sector. And therefore, we always believe that it's good to make people happy. And so, I guess if we look at these different policy areas and we look at these different policy challenges, whatever we want to achieve, we should at least know that we can maybe make 1.3 billion people happier at the end of the process than we did at the beginning. Thank you very much.
Agradecendo mais uma vez ao professor Brown. Vamos abrir agora para 20 minutos de perguntas à plateia. Alguém que tem alguma pergunta, se quiser, as moças vão levar o microfone. E eu gostaria de aproveitar então e fazer uma primeira pergunta direcionada ao professor Brown. O plano quinquenal, o 12º plano quinquenal chinês, que entrou em vigor agora, ele prevê a China também visando se tornar uma potência marítima. Isso diz respeito, claro, às questões com o Japão, com o Vietnã e outras questões regionais que também devem ser resolvidas por uma geração nova do partido que vai tomar as Forças Armadas agora. O que o senhor vê nos próximos 5 anos sobre a gestão de Xi Jinping para essa questão do domínio marítimo chinês e para toda a questão militar chinesa nessa nova configuração do Politburo?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems is the China vision well, what kind of power does China want to be? So Yan Xuetong at, I think, Beijing University talked of China being a kind of, having a vision in which it is it's morally a great power. It's an alternative kind of model to America, and it sort of fulfills its historic mission to be a great power. And the question is, well, is there space for it to do that without antagonism from the other powers? And obviously at the heart of that is sea power and the deployment of its abilities beyond its own borders. But then there are others who say the dominant need of the new leadership is to look at these internal issues, that they cannot become a model for anyone else while battling with these big developmental issues. So Wen Jiabao and others, the current premier and others, they talk lots of a China which on aggregate is very wealthy, but per capita is still very, very poor. So this is really a kind of big conceptual problem. You have a rich China that's also poor, and that impacts on its vision of itself. The contradiction for the current leaders, the new leaders, is they have to balance focusing on their internal issues, which are huge, and creating a more prosperous society and finding sources of growth which are going to be more difficult in the future. The era of Hu Jintao has been dominated by amazing wealth creation, but that has to come to an end. So this new leadership will deal with socio-political issues to deliver governance, good governance, and kind of GDP growth. But they cannot walk away from being global actors because they're the world's second biggest economy. And so their traditional language of foreign policy engagement, non-intervention, is no longer really valid. So you will have a China which, in its heart, still wants to deal with these internal issues, but in fact is going to be a really significant global actor. And I don't think that tension will disappear in the next decade. It will always be torn between its internal problems, but also the fact that it's now, as an economy, as a geopolitical actor, as a diplomatic actor, it's a global power.
Hello. Australia has recently published the Asian paper about his own vision about the future and the rise of Asia, and particularly about China. What's your opinion about that, and do you recommend to Brazil to have his own Asian strategic planning?
Am I able to quote Henry Kissinger here? Always a very uncomfortable moment, but he famously said, what's the phone number of the European Union? So what's the phone number of Asia? Does anyone have the phone number of Asia? I suspect it's a Beijing number. I suspect it's got a 01 at the front of it. So when we talk of, like, Australia has just issued a white paper on the Asian century. I think it's the white paper on the Asian. And I mean, this is obviously, to be honest, this is a big, con, because it's about China. Most of the paper is about China, and India, of course, but really about China. So I think we can help by not thinking of the rise of Asia. There's very little multilateralism, and what happened in ASEAN in the last couple of days is interesting, because China just walked away, really, from some of the key things they were discussing, the maritime borders and this. China just walked away. So we have to really think of the dominance of China in that region and how the countries around it are going to work with that. That will be really tough. That will be really, really tough.
Perhaps I could... Thank you. I contributed to that white paper, and it's on our company's website. And my particular focus was on a major statement made a year ago by Hu Jintao, the then leader of the Communist Party, in which he called for building a cultural great power. And the burden of what we said was, this is in many ways understandable and a respectable goal. And what other countries in this sphere of influence should do is they must also respect themselves as cultural great powers. And I think that is not a difficult thing for Brazil. In my 2 days here, I find that this is already a cultural great power. But to be a cultural great power is in many ways a false ambition. It's fine to be a cultural middle power, and that's all Australia can really be. The problem is that China is such a massive force in cultural terms. The Chinese language is already the second most spoken language in Australia. So Australia is in the front line of the impact, but it's only a matter of time before this impact is felt elsewhere. But the story will be very different. The world looks different from here, and it's beyond me to say what you should do.
Mais alguma pergunta? Nenhuma pergunta? Aqui.
Obrigado, Sérgio Amaral. Eu tenho perguntas de novo, e dessa vez são duas. A primeira poderia ser para os dois professores, Kelly e Brown. E ela é a seguinte: a questão da desigualdade vai muito além da China hoje, né? A questão da desigualdade parece ser uma praga mundial. A desigualdade aumentou nos Estados Unidos recentemente. O professor Wright recentemente deu um número de que 10% da população americana detém 50% do produto. O Brasil é um dos países com mais desigualdade. E na China, a desigualdade está crescendo de uma forma acelerada. Só um exemplo que é meio prosaico: a BBC fez um documentário sobre a China, e a China tem hoje um clube de detentores de Ferrari. Um dos seus membros tem 3 Ferraris. E isso é considerado natural, embora seja uma grande preocupação do Partido Comunista Chinês e dos novos dirigentes, possivelmente. Quais são as indicações disponíveis sobre como a China pretende, ou a nova liderança, o Partido Comunista, pretende tratar desta questão e enfrentá-la? São programas de renda mínima, como no caso do Brasil? É um maior acesso a políticas universais, como educação, saúde, previdência? É o emprego? E quais são as possíveis ações de política que poderiam estar sendo consideradas? Porque, pelo menos aqui, ou eu, pelo menos, não tenho muita clareza sobre isso. A segunda pergunta é para o professor Brown e para o seu comentário de que os parceiros da China deveriam prestar mais atenção no papel crítico dos atores não estatais. Quem seriam esses atores? Porque a ideia que se tem de fora é um pouco difusa. Existem manifestações, muitas vezes espontâneas, demonstrações a nível local, mas não fica muito claro quem são esses atores não estatais que estariam participando mais do jogo político ou do jogo econômico.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with all the equipment today, and I missed the first part of the question. But I can answer the second part to some extent. I've worked on the NGO sector in China. In China, the word NGO is a very troublesome word. This is a typical case of an uncertainty. The government knows that as economic reform takes new shapes, new forms, the old role of the state, which was to provide cradle-to-grave care in the unit society, as Lo Xiaopeng mentioned, the Danwei society, can no longer be achieved. And moreover, as I argued, the society itself has to make demands and can only achieve a social justice policy aim by having some kind of expression of their interest. So legitimate expression of interests from beyond the state is recognized by the whole policy community as very important. And at the same time, there is another voice, if you like, within the mind of the ruling elite, which says that social order comes first, stability comes first, and that an unregulated state, social actors are a source of instability. So when now there is a need to take care of aged people living in high-rise buildings who can no longer get to the store to buy their food, there is a need for voluntary action of people in society to help them. This is a problem for the state. And the state has to take a back step or has to bring in regulatory provisions to allow these groups to be autonomous. And that has been a point at which policy has been challenged to the hilt in the last few years. From what we saw of this speech given by Hu Jintao as he left his office, his final speech, he used the expression, 政社分开, the separation of government and society. This is a very significant expression. It hadn't been used, to our knowledge, in his previous major speeches. We're still analyzing this, and the takeaway message is there is a definite move to empowering more people in society, and especially organizational freedom. Freedom of association is in some ways the key freedom. More important than freedom of speech, more important than freedom from political surveillance is the capacity of groups of people in society to represent themselves and bring their interests to the state. And I think that this is an area we have seen developments in the last few years. We saw in Guangdong province under Wang Yang some give in terms of empowering people to organize, to express their interests.
Yeah, on inequality, the Gini coefficient, I think in 2001 was 0.4, which is the sort of danger mark, and now it's 0.43, so it's gone, I mean, quite a way beyond. So Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao from 2004, they made it a political priority to try and deal with inequality at one of the plenums. But they were overtaken by the Western financial crisis and, I mean, a whole number of other structural issues, and so inequality remains a massive, massive problem. They have two great, the current leaders have two great advantages. The first is social optimism. I mean, 92% of people interviewed by Pew last month said that they felt their lives were better than their parents were. And this idea that tomorrow is always better than today is still dominant. So I think that optimism helps, even for those who are losers in this, you know, kind of, they do think things will get better. Migrant laborers are very optimistic, you know, they do think they're working for a better future. And that optimism will creep down, obviously, but I think it's still a big help. The other is to create, you know, social welfare, like David said. There's got to be, you know, some ways of creating a social welfare system. It's spelled out in the 12th five-year program, but it's really a sense of prioritizing. You have a healthcare system, or you try and kind of really prioritize the undeveloped parts of China. I mean, this is still a country with I think 150 million people living in absolute poverty, so still huge issues of entrenched poverty. But this is a government with a great deal of experience of developmental policy, so, I mean, they're as well placed as anyone to deal with it. Non-state, well, there's two. I mean, non-state actors in terms of businesses, well, they're easy to find. They're everywhere. I mean, they employ lots of people. If you look at the China Entrepreneurs Club, they have 44 of the people you're talking about. They are people like the head of Mengniu, a food company, Suntech in Zhejiang, an alternative energy company, ZTE, a telecoms company. I mean, they're in very diverse sectors, and they are amazing. I mean, they're incredible companies and incredible deliverers of innovation and growth, and I think that they'll become more and more important. They're not hard to find. In terms of non-state actors in non-government organizations, it's more politically contentious because they have been regarded as deliverers of threats to the legitimacy of the party. But again, I mean, there are many who deliver education for migrant laborers, who deliver healthcare for the elderly, who are looking at these issues of social equity. And I mean, there's already a kind of rich amount of dialogue between non-Chinese and Chinese NGOs. The issue there really is the legal status that they work within at the moment, which is very uncertain.
This is a question in English. Several times in this panel and the previous panel, there's been a discussion of non-state actors, NGOs, and the balance between the urban and the rural. And it's gone far beyond what in the United States and here is, in Britain, neoliberal, in the United States and here, neoconservatism. And it almost seems that it's touching on libertarian, going back to the days of mercantilism and the East Indies Company, where people come and offer, and that was subsequently enforced after the Opium Wars by Methodist missionaries. And that's why they're called Methodists, because they have a method. And how can you deny that this is in lockstep with this new libertarian movement that we're seeing in the United States and in Europe with the pirate parties that are connected to wealthy mega interests like the Koch brothers in the United States, who have agendas in this country and everywhere? And that's my question. Is it gone beyond, are you going with these NGOs and these ideas of non-state actors in back to the future in terms of libertarianism and the old mercantilism with the East Indies Company or the Hamburg trading houses that had their own colleges and universities and trained people? I mean, where is this really going? Or doesn't anybody know? I mean, it's supposed to be entertainment, like you say, but tell us, doctors.
Well, one of the great joys of dealing with China is you don't have to deal with America, and it seems like your question is more about America than it is about China. And as a British person, I'm in constant refuge around the world from not finally talking about America, because I don't want to. So in China, I look at it only within a Chinese framework, and that long list of isms you gave, I mean, I just think how you're going to create a higher value-added economy, which is the government's aspiration. And I think that non-state companies are, they have less access to loans, they are smaller, they're more flexible. State-owned enterprises are very profitable, that's true. Since 2008, they have been very profitable, but that's because they have very privileged sectors, energy, infrastructure, resources. And as Nicholas was saying in his presentation, the amounts of capital investment there are not sustainable. I don't think it's not something you can sustain forever. And therefore, it seems to me that a non-state sector which has more flexibility, more need to innovate, it just seems logical that that will be a creator of value for the Chinese economy in the future. For non-state organizations, it's a slightly different thing. The state cannot supply many of the things that this society going through huge changes is going to need: care for the elderly, some educational provision. They already have a big, the issue is not that they have a role, they already have a role. Tsinghua University comes out with statistics about many thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of non-government organizations. The role of volunteering in the Wenchuan earthquake in 2008 was very, very big. In crisis management, volunteering is very important. At the Expo in Shanghai, many thousands, well, 90,000 volunteers. And so these are things that are accepted, but there is no legal, there's no legal status for these groups. And that means that they live in a great deal of uncertainty. And as I said, predictability is an enemy. Unpredictability in this system, in the Chinese system, is an enemy of stability and an enemy of, kind of being able to have, sort of kind of stable policy growth. And so I would have thought one of the things the new leadership needs to do is to give a proper legal status for non-government organisations, rather than let them live in this grey zone.
Can I just add that to justify the legitimacy of non-state actors, you need go no further than the works of Karl Marx, who called for a society in which the workers would organize for their own interests. And one of the hardest things to achieve in China is an independent trade union. And so this is why the people who speak of these things often start with Marx and Marxism. Another point to make is that the words we use, non-state actor, they are coming from the outside. That is not the term used in China. So we have to make the transition from a frame of reference, which is actually alien to China's own frame of reference. There, the expression in Chinese, for those of you who know Chinese, is Minjian Shehui. Minjian means among the people. So there is implicitly a distinction between the state ruling elite and the people they lead. And this is where the negotiation takes place. It takes place on that axis, and not a question of state or non-state. And when you think about it, in our societies, we're all part of a state when we pay taxes, but we have a different set of legitimating values when we participate in a citizen association of some kind. And that's all that's implied here. There is no necessary implication that these groups are opposing the state. They are merely the holders of a different set of legitimating principles. And the big problem is that the state traditionally monopolized all sources of legitimacy.
Bom, nosso tempo infelizmente está encerrado. Gostaria de agradecer novamente o professor David Kelly e o professor Kerry Brown. Agradecer a todos os presentes pela participação. Muito obrigado.